So this is a tutorial about cranial nerves. I think this might be the easiest way to learn them. I want to explain upper motor neurones, lower motor neurones, the pyramidal system and the extrapyramidal system, the requirements for spasticity and bilateral innervation for cranial nerves. So I think the easiest way to start is by looking at a relatively simpler nerve, the spinal nerves. So I'm going to give you an example of a spinal motor nerve, so the nerve that supplies the muscles to the rest of the body, something that we're not usually used to dealing with. So the typical nerve will start in the cerebral cortex, up in the motor strip, up here. Go through the internal capsule, down to the midbrain, through the pons, to the medulla. Now this is where 90% of spinal nerves decussate. They cross the body to the opposite side. And then they continue right down to the rest of the spine. And where they finish up, it depends on which muscle they're innervating. So an arm muscle versus a leg will be a lot lower in the spine. So they synapse at the appropriate level. And from there, within the spinal cord, the next nerve starts at the synapse, comes out of the spinal cord, and feeds into the muscle itself. So innervates the muscle directly. So you can see from this that there's a clear division, and it's different for each nerve, but the green one here is called the upper motor neuron, and the blue one there is the lower motor neuron, and I think it's pretty obvious why they're called that. So the green one's upper motor neuron, and then the second one that feeds actually into the muscle, the lower motor neuron. So let me just show you that again in the coronal section. So starts in the motor cortex, goes through the internal capsule, into the midbrain, through the pons, and then, as I said, when they get to the medulla, 90% of them decussate, and then they go down for whatever length down the spine, and that's where they synapse. So the decussation is there. And the lower motor neuron takes over, feeds out of the spine, and out into the muscle. The other name for the green one here is the pyramidal system. So let me draw a little pyramid. The reason it's called that is because as they travel through the brainstem here, they travel right through the anterior part. And if you were to look at the front, so along this edge here, that's what you get on this far right picture. So they actually travel right through these parts here bilaterally. And evidently somebody decided that they look like pyramids, two little pyramids sticking out of the medulla. So that's why they're called the pyramidal nerve, or the pyramidal tract. But there's also other nerves that influence the muscles, even though they don't synapse directly. The extrapyramidal system. So you have a lot of nerves coming in from the cerebellum to help with coordination. You have a lot from the premotor cortex via the basal ganglia coming down. You get some sensory ones from the thalamus, information from the vestibular system. All of those have an impact on the nerves, but they don't directly contact the lower motor neuron itself. So they are called the extrapyramidal extrapyramidal, the extrapyramidal system. Now, an important thing to think about here is spasticity. So how does spasticity occur? If we take the example of a stroke in the cortex somewhere, so maybe in the motor cortex itself, the upper motor neuron is damaged, and the important part of the upper motor neuron in spasticity is that it has an inhibitory effect on the stretch reflex. Without the inhibitory effect, that upper motor neuron isn't there to tell it to relax, not to be so sensitive. So the lower motor neuron overcontracts and you get spasticity. So it overreacts to being stretched. So you wouldn't get that with a lower motor neuron lesion. If you cut that, you're literally cutting the nerve, so the muscle just goes limp. It's pulling the power cord out. But to get spasticity, it's an upper motor neuron lesion. Okay, so that's the spinal nerve. As I said, not something we're used to dealing with. If we actually move down and talk about the cranial nerves now. So the cranial nerves are different, obviously. They're called cranial nerves because they're contained completely within the cranium. They don't need the spine. So let me give you an example of a cranial nerve. They start in the same place, in the motor cortex. They come through the internal capsule, just like a spinal nerve. They come down to the brainstem, just the same. But they decussate different areas of the brainstem, and immediately after, they synapse, or very soon after. So again, they decussate, and then they synapse. So then the lower motor neuron begins within the brainstem. So for example, the fifth cranial nerve, the trigeminal, will exit from the pons out to the face to the muscles of mastication. So just remember, we're only talking about the motor aspects of cranial nerves. So I'll show you again in the coronal section. We'll start in the motor cortex, usually down lower, for the ones we're interested in. Through the internal capsule here, into the midbrain, they'll decussate, and then they'll synapse. And then the fifth cranial nerve exits about here. So you've also got the others that we're interested in, the facial nerve exits about this, slightly higher. The 9th and 10th from the medulla, and the 12th sort of in the middle there. So we still have that division, the upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons. Because one goes from the cortex to the synapse, the other goes from the synapse to the muscle. Same as the spinal cord. We also still have the pyramidal system and the extrapyramidal system, same as the spinal cord. Let me just write those in. Upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron, I'm sure you understand by now. So we still get upper and lower motor neurons, we still get pyramidal and extrapyramidal, but now this is the difference between cranial nerves and most spinal nerves. Cranial nerves are actually bilaterally innervated. So if we look at this coronal section, when it gets to the decussation, it also stays on its own side, ipsilaterally. Or if we were to do the other side, cortex, internal capsule, and then that synapses with its own side as well as the other side. And that's almost all of them without exception, but of course there is an exception. So the trigeminal is completely bilateral. All its muscles have innervation from both sides. The glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerves completely bilateral. Facial nerve The exception is the lower face. So the lower face only receives input from one side. The hypoglossal nerve is completely bilateral except for the muscles of protrusion in the tongue. So those are the only exceptions. So what does this mean? It means that in the case of a stroke in the cortex, so let's put one here for instance. This poor person's having a right hemisphere stroke. If you follow this dark green, it's going to cut all the innervation for both of those, but that doesn't really matter because the other side's taking over. So you don't get much weakness at all. And you also won't get the spasticity because you're still getting the inhibitory response from the other side. That's for the bilateral nerves. If we talk about the exceptions once more, this is an excellent diagram. Excellent diagram of the fifth cranial nerve. Sorry, the seventh, the facial nerve. You can see here that there's bilateral innervation for the top half of the face, so that's no problem. You can see them decussating here, feeding into their own side and the other side. In the lower half of the face, you only get the contralateral side. So imagine if there was a stroke to occur here. So all that orange you can see disappears. So what's left? If we divide the face up, the upper left face is fine, the lower left face is fine, the upper right face is pretty good, the lower left face has a weakness. So a left cortical stroke that affects the facial nerve, you'll see that in the lower right face, and same with the tongue. When they protrude their tongue, it's a really rough tongue, that will lean to the right because the muscle of protrusion on one side is not working, so it's getting pushed over. And that's really the only asymmetry you'll see in the cranial nerves with a stroke in that position or anywhere along this section here. Okay. So it's a pretty useful setup to have. So then you don't get weakness, you don't get spasticity for most of these nerves. How do we end up with weakness or spasticity? Well, you would need to have a stroke on both sides, which would be pretty unlucky, but it does happen. So not exactly mirrored, but it could be anywhere along this tract. Failing that, it would be a brainstem stroke. Now, if the person survives a brainstem stroke, which is not a given, because you've got all the nerves of the brain sort of bunching together here, you can have both innervation from both sides knocked out for a given side. You will get some pretty severe damage and potentially spasticity, depending where it is. And also in a traumatic brain injury, you get bouncing, you get quite diffuse damage throughout the brain. And there's a high likelihood of spasticity with traumatic brain injury as well. So hopefully that's explained upper motor neurons, lower motor neurons, pyramidal and extrapyramidal spasticity, and bilateral innervation of the cranial nerves.